Whenever you visit a distillery in Scotland for the first time, one of the first pieces of information you're going to come across, whether it's being told by your tour guide or host, or noticing it on the logo as you walk through the distillery, is the date the distillery was founded on. Or naturally, if you're nowhere near Scotland, you can just pick up your nearest single malt whiskey bottle and you'll see the date on the label. And we currently have 165 active distilleries in Scotland making new mixed spirit for whiskey that have all opened over the past 260 plus years. And of course, many, many more that have mothballed and permanently closed during that time as well. Because for the past 2.5 centuries, the Scottish whisky industry has been at the mercy of a tidal wave of external factors, from government duty and excises, crippling economic turmoil, world wars, pandemics, and the peaks and troughs of fickle consumer trends. And if you wanted to paint an accurate picture of all these ups and downs, all you actually have to do is take all the opening dates for all these distilleries, group them by decade, and you can see quite clearly all the ups and downs where the demand for new distilleries whiskies came in or where everything went down the pan again. Now, just to clarify, these are all the dates of the current operating distilleries. I have not included all the permanently closed distilleries in Scotland, but this still paints the same picture either way. So, kicking off in the mid to late 18th century, what the lack of distilleries here tells us is that the late 1700s was not a great time to be a whiskey entrepreneur in Scotland. The malt taxes introduced by the English government in 1725 created insane and violent riots in places like Glasgow, no buckfast required guys, and naturally encouraged illicit distillation across Scotland. The malt taxes affected beer too, which was far safer to drink than water at the time. If you throw on top of that annual distilling fees and minimum production requirements, the average farmer or Highland chieftain was not going to declare their whiskey and spirit making profits willingly to the government. So the few distilleries that did open after this were still in the far-flung corners of Scotland in places like Orkney, Islay and up in the hills in the Highlands, where it was harder for the taxmen to pay a visit. Or in the Central Highlands, like Scotland's oldest operating distillery, the Glen Turret down in Crieff, which opened in 1763. Realising that illicit distillation was insanely rife in the Highlands and Islands, the Wash Act was introduced in 1784, which I touched on briefly in Whisky Bite number 10, to introduce regional taxes, but that just added fuel to the fire. So by the 1790s, we have a substantial increase in the amount of distilleries thanks to the Wash Act. Also, what happens more notably as Scotland moves into the 19th century is the early industrialisation, which creates transport links between Scottish towns and cities to move barley, spirit, casks and whiskey from country to ports and towns, as well as commercial farming creating wider supply of barley to be malted. Moving into the 1800s, we have the birth of the whiskey industry as we know it today, with several peaks and troughs. But we're off to a flying start in the 1810s, despite still being in the era of illicit distillation, with 9 more distilleries followed by another 19 in the 1820s, thanks to the arrival of the Excise Act in 1823, where you could pay a whopping £10 to license your still, with levelled out excise duties, and you could store whiskey in a warehouse prior to duty being added. 1824 naturally was a popular year for distilling licenses, with famous names like the Macallan and Glenlivet having this as their founding dates. In 1830, you had the coffee still being created to create continuous distillation for making grain whiskey, which took off in the Lowlands, and apparently it was the decade of the Glens, with Glen Scotia, Glengoyne, Glenfarclas, Glenkinchie, and Glenord opening up. Despite the surge in distilleries opening, however, the vast majority of people around this time weren't really sold on drinking whiskey as much as cognacs, rums, beers, and wines. Whiskey at the time was consumed young or unaged, and casks were still widely just being used for storage and transportation, and peat was still widespread for malting barley. But by the 1840s, blending was really taking hold when grocers like John Walker, John Dewar and the Chivas brothers realised you could blend all these intense malts together to make a whiskey greater than the sum of its parts. Not that you would guess it here with the lack of distilleries in the 1850s and the 1860s, but sometimes there just needs to be a catalyst to really kickstart the demand, and in the case of Scottish whisky, it was right here in the 1860s and 1870s when a little outbreak of phylloxera in France decimated just under 50% of the vineyards in a few decades, destroying both the reputation of cognac, brandy and French wines as well as the grapes for production, which was perfect timing for blended scotches to come in and fill the void. So by the 1890s, with all the iconic blended scotches taking over the world, the demand for more distilleries skyrockets, with the likes of Glenfiddich having opened in 1887, followed by sister distillery Balvenie in 1892, and it's very much worth noting that 18 of these 21 distilleries from the 1890s are all from the region now known as Speyside. So it was a very significant shift for that region where there was plenty of fertile land for growing barley, and with now well-established train lines making it easier to transport spirit, whiskey casks, coal and other resources back and forth. This was also the era of Charles Cree Doig Distilleries, made famous by his signature pagoda roof, or Doig ventilator as it's known, and he was noted to have been involved with the design of almost 60 distilleries across Scotland. Then come the early 1900s and it all goes to shit. Starting with the fallout of the Pattison crash, whereby the greed and ambition of brothers Walter and Robert Pattison, not to be confused with the guy from Twilight, two flamboyant whiskey blenders and bottlers, had created a bubble in the Scottish whiskey market through overinflated pricing, over-leveraged stakes in distilleries, bad accounting and lots of debt, which sent the entire whiskey industry into a precipitous decline and kick-started a fallout resulting in almost no new distilleries for 50 years. On top of this, we can add in the First World War in the 1910s, where barley supplies were needed for rations, labour becomes scarce due to enlistment demands, and global trade routes become compromised. Then on top of that, in the 1920s, we had Prohibition in Scottish whisky's major export market, the United States, though arguably Scottish whisky fared slightly better than Irish whisky during this time, after we agreed to a cheeky few export deals with Al Capone's cronies. Then for the entirety of the 1930s, we had the Great Economic Depression, of course, just to put another nail in the whiskey coffin. And then let's just add in World War II in the 1940s just to compound things a little more. And then finally some light at the end of the tunnel as we come into the 1950s and into the post-war whiskey boom, all accelerated by the growth of 20th century advertising, marketing and capitalism. The 1960s sees the launch of the first commercial single malts, with Glenfiddich releasing pure malt, as well as opening the first visitor centre for a Scottish distillery, starting the Scottish whisky tourism boom. With the new demand for blends and single malts, we see the first modern wave of 20th century distilleries designed by the likes of William Delham Evans, who was involved with the designs or redesigns of over 20 distilleries in Scotland between the 50s and the 80s. And then of course, in the 1980s, it all goes to shit again, as vodka and white spirits take over the world and whiskey is no longer seen as cool by the new generation of drinkers, and whiskey was monikered as your dad's drink. And an oversupply of whiskey production saw the mothballing and closure of 33 Scottish distilleries. But we did see the arrival of the Scotch Whisky Act in 1988 to provide a legal definition and protect the identity and quality of whiskey made in Scotland. The 90s were still very much a recovery period coming out of the whiskey lock, however, but single malts were beginning to get traction again, global markets were expanding, and people became more adventurous with their palates after a decade of vodka and white spirits. And we see the birth of the modern craft Scottish distillery movement with the opening of Lochranza Distillery in Arran in 1995. And finally, we move into the 21st century where the zeitgeist of the modern internet kicks in, and online whiskey bloggers start reviewing all the vintage single malts that are in abundance from the 60s, 70s and 80s for the new era of whiskey fans and communities around the world. We see the birth of the modern cocktail bars helping whiskey find a younger audience, fine dining pairing whiskey and food together, and an explosion in online travel bookings taking more people to Scotland to experience Scottish distilleries and whiskey festivals. And then we also see small-scale distilleries like Daftmill and Kilcoman opening up in 2005, taking whiskey back to its farming roots. Until we hit the 2010s and we get the arrival of 36 new distilleries surfing the wave of the rise of spirits premiumisation and the explosion in demand for single malt, single cask whiskies, limited editions, the growth of the secondary whiskey market, luxury whiskey experiences, older distilleries expanding their production capacities, and just all-round peak whiskey madness. Which carries on into the 2020s with the spike in whiskey sales during COVID, then blip, we're back into another shitstorm of scenarios, multiple wars, the rise of non-alcoholic drinks, increased cost of goods, Brexit, wobbly economies, and despotic dictators for presidents giving us massive tariffs to deal with. And so, my friends, as you can see from all these decades where distilleries have been going boom or bust, the whiskey industry is and always has been about peaks and troughs over the past 260 years or more, and history always manages to repeat itself in some shape or form. So the next time you visit a distillery in Scotland and you hear the opening date, or you pick up a bottle of single malt whiskey and see the date on the label, you'll know what was happening in that decade for the madness to take hold in someone's brain to decide to open up a distillery to start making Scottish whiskey. Cheers.